The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turteltaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from Los Angeles is Vera Cherepanova. Vera is Executive Director at the nonprofit Boards of the Future, and today we're going to be talking about boards, governance, and compliance. Vera, first, let me ask you, what governance challenges are boards underestimating that compliance officers are seeing up close and concerned about?
Thank you, Adam. I'm delighted to be back to Compliance Perspectives. Hello, boys and girls, ladies and gents. Hope you're enjoying your day. A great question to kickstart the conversation, and I will give you a couple of things. The first is going to be culture as risk, not as soft stuff, not as sideline issue, but as front and center risk factor and a hard driver of misconduct. Culture can be a risk mitigator or a risk multiplier, and we know it from experience in ethics and compliance. But boards still don't include this into their understanding of risk oversight, which is, by the way, one of the main responsibilities of board serving on companies. It's a shame as we have so much accumulated knowledge on this, and there's a lot going on this front in the UK, for example, right now with the new company code coming into action. And I've just listened to another podcast hosted by the UK Financial Reporting Council, and there's a very clear signal here of regulatory intent on culture. So what they basically did is they made a very subtle but very powerful change in the new version of the code. They added literally one word, but it makes total sense when you see where that word actually was added. The main principle now says that boards must ensure all purpose, values, strategy, and culture are aligned. And FRC is clearly pushing boards to view culture as fully integrated into the governance architecture and not existing somewhere on sidelines. Can you imagine something like that coming from SEC? I don't know, a rhetorical question. So the second challenge here is not everything is about regulation. Again, I think we've eaten the dog on this in ethics and compliance, and I think the whole idea of having ethics and compliance instead of just compliance as the name of the department and as the function and the description of what that function actually does and stands for, I think all of that is coming from the awareness of the fact that you cannot have a rule for everything, because we know that, the fact that something can be done does not mean that it should be done, but it's still a mystery to boards. And I can illustrate it using the example of stakeholders. Here, boards are perpetually caught between following the rules and doing the right thing and the greatest good for the greatest number. So we can say that governance in this sense is deontological, and this is a fancy way of saying following the rules, line of moral philosophy. So deontological at the top, but very consequentialist in practice, because in practice we would always need to see how actual people and actual stakeholders and organizations will be affected by us following the rules or doing otherwise, right? So therefore, effective boards need to translate rules into value for the organizations they serve through deliberate dialogue, dissent, disagreement sometimes, but constructive disagreement, and long-term stewardship focus.
That's a significant change. And in light of it, has the role of compliance and governance shifted in recent years? And what's driving that change?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. And absolutely, I think that compliance entered governance in very big ways. Let me first give you one example of Coldplay. Everyone knows it, right? Everyone knows that a CEO of a company went to a concert with a direct report sitting in the executive team, and they unintentionally were caught on camera and revealed their romantic relationship to the whole world, including employees of that company, shareholders, and the board, and of course their families. Yes, but that's a more of a personal drama. The public immediately questioned, where was the board? How, did they know? And then why didn't they do anything about it? If they didn't know, where were their eyes, and how do they actually serve that company? All right. So board feeling the heat and feeling compelled to act decisively so that no one will be on their back, fired the CEO the next day. So we see as how compliance issue just turned into a governance failure with a very quantifiable, very clear impact on the bottom line. Because firing a CEO and then finding a new CEO, that's a kind of a big deal for any organization. And it's not even the best part, because the best part is that it could have been effectively prevented. So, and this is only one example how compliance actually enters governance, right? There are other big ways, and we've seen that in recent years. We can go back to pandemic and how the focus on supply chains entered governance in a big way. Then there was ESG when compliance functions were brought in investor facing work, right? Doing some disclosures for G and even broader AI, technology, new ethical and regulatory risks, where compliance is the first responder. Again, all of that goes directly into the boardroom, and also the regulatory scrutiny of boards themselves in terms of the duty of oversight, and many cases coming from there. Um, so I think it makes total sense for boards to have a reflection point here and actually take good stock of how in big ways compliance entered the governance process and the process of decision making.
And just follow up on that whole Coldplay incident, I think it bears noting that we're recording this a day or two after the CEO of Nestle was removed. So, what do you see as the forces leading to change in the future?
Boards main two tasks, if we look at this from a very high level perspective, are value protection and value creation. All the governance dance is about balancing the two. Value protection, how do we make sure that we protect the value that we already have as a company? And value creation, how do we make sure that we multiply that value? And I will give you one example for, or a couple of forces leading to change, and one example for value protection and the other one for value creation. So on value protection, regionalization is going to hit in a big way. We're moving away from the idea of global regulatory convergence. Instead, rules are diverging. The US, the EU, Asia, all of the jurisdictions, all of the regions are pulling in different directions right now. And you can take AI, you can take ESG and sustainability, you can take supply chains and sanctions, and whatever you take, you will see it reflected. Boards are used to one global compliance system playbook, which existed for quite some time. They got used to it. But I'm not sure it's no longer viable. No, I'm actually very sure that it's no longer viable. Yes. It will only become more obvious in the coming years. And already now, one survey after another shows regulatory risk as a top concern for boards. They already know it, they already feel it. But this anxiety and that feeling will only intensify, I would say, in the coming years. And boards will have to have an expert on the board to untangle this complexity, because it would be completely not doable without that expert. But they still do not know that, I think. On value creation, values and value statements are now being seen by the public as binding commitments. They see it as contractual obligations, and breaking them is seen as misconduct, act of misconduct. Remember boycotts against Target earlier this year? Well, people were we're thinking, we're deliberating. If you said DEI is critical to you, then you need to stand for it, right? So that's your obligation. And boards still underestimate this. Many boards still think that values can be aspirational, good for the wall. But as we've just seen from the FRC example earlier, the screws actually get tightened. Values, culture, strategy, and purpose need to be aligned. And this is now a formalized expectation embedded in governance and decision making. The boards that get this will be effective at creating value for the organizations they serve.
And value provided is the measure of the board. So, what else do you see is coming next?
Well, we've talked about blind spots, including non-financial risks, or to put it more accurately, non-financial in origin, but financial in consequence, as, for example, the Coldplay example, right? The CEO got fired, and finding a new CEO, it's going to take a while. There is going to be an impact on the bottom line, absolutely, obviously, right? So this is a non-financial risk with a financial consequence. One thing that I see coming is making sure these non-financial issues are reflected in the financial statements. This is a very big line of thinking and line of work across the globe. In some shape or form, it needs to happen because too many of those risks exist outside of the financial statements. And looking at numbers, and you mentioned it earlier, that boards are typically looking at numbers. Well, what kind of numbers they are looking at? What kind of a perspective do these numbers provide if all of the topics of most concern, like AI, tech, sustainability, just exist outside of that? And also, geopolitical shocks and supply chain concerns. All right, so I can make a reference to the IFRS sustainability standards here, or for example, the EU CSRD, as an attempt to do that, to create some kind of set of non-financial reporting. But it is essentially not only about sustainability in a narrow sense. It is about sustainability in a broader sense, organizational longevity. We can say a lot, right? So how sustainable the company is in the longer term, in terms of value generation and value multiplication. There is an effort to make financial statements a true and fair reflection of the state of the company, and I'm involved into that work a little. It's coming. It's coming next. And the second blind spot we talked about is a lack of ethical preparedness. When crisis hits, boards are never ready. All that we see is usually a reflex, a knee-jerk reaction. Fire the CEO, act decisively, look like you have a good grip on things. And it's interesting. I work with boards on a daily basis, and it's interesting to see how they can tirelessly run tabletop exercises on tariffs, which was happening in the last 6 months, and then see all the effort fly out of the window because people in Washington just changed their mind. But they will never, absolutely never, run scenario exercises around values conflicts, which actually happen all the time. There are always trade-offs. There are always values conflicts. And we talked about this earlier, the deontology at the top and the consequentialism in practice. That makes, and all of that leads to reactive and potentially reputationally damaging responses in a crisis. And we see the headlines, and we see it all the time. Boards will need to prepare for values-based dilemmas better, just as they do for cyber attacks, financial shocks, just for all other risks.
Finally, let me ask, how should governing bodies draw on compliance expertise to strengthen decision making in the future?
We need to get a seat at the table. By we, I mean ethics and compliance and risk professionals, not as some bolt-on supervisor, or as I have seen in some other jurisdictions, but as full board members with voice, vote, and authority. And boards don't need compliance in the room for compliance's sake. They need compliance in the room because it makes their decisions stronger, more resilient, and more trusted. And the faster it's going to come, the faster it's going to happen, the better it will be for companies and the society at large.
You are most definitely not alone in advocating for that. We definitely need more compliance people on boards. Well, Vera, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turteltaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.